The rain had barely stopped when the knock came. 3 days had passed since my father's funeral, yet the silence inside the house still felt heavier than grief itself. Every room seemed to echo with things that had never been said. My husband, David Carter, had already laughed at my inheritance twice. The first time was inside the attorney's office. The second time was in our kitchen while casually stirring sugar into his morning coffee, as if mocking my father's final gift was no different than commenting on the weather. But neither of those moments stayed with me. What stayed with me was the man standing on my front porch. He looked to be nearly 80. His silver hair moved gently in the cool November breeze, and both hands held an old leather hat that had clearly traveled thousands of miles. For several long seconds, he didn't even look at me. His eyes traveled past my shoulder into the dining room. Then they stopped. On the small wooden box sitting in the center of the table, something changed in his expression. Not surprise, recognition, relief, almost as if he had been afraid he might arrive too late. "Claire," he said softly. I hadn't heard anyone say my name in that voice for almost 15 years. "Mr. Brooks." He smiled faintly. "I suppose you've forgotten how old I've become." I hadn't. Arthur Brooks had been my grandfather's closest friend long before I was born. When Grandpa died, Arthur slowly disappeared from our lives. Not because anyone forced him away. Life simply carried people in different directions. Now he stood in front of me looking older, but somehow stronger than everyone I'd seen during the funeral. Then he asked a question that made every hair on my arm stand up. "Have you opened the back of the watch yet?" For a moment, I couldn't breathe, because until that second, I honestly believed my grandfather's broken pocket watch was nothing more than one final disappointment, one final reminder that I would always come last. I had absolutely no idea. It was only the beginning. 3 days earlier, the cemetery outside Savannah had been wrapped in a cold southern rain. Not a dramatic storm, just the kind of steady drizzle that soaked through your coat without making a sound. My father, Thomas Whitaker, was finally being buried. He had been 78 years old, complicated, reserved, the kind of man who believed love should be demonstrated through responsibility rather than affection. Growing up, I couldn't remember him ever saying he was proud of me. Not once. He paid for college. He fixed my car when it broke down. He never missed a birthday. But hugs, kind words, simple encouragement, those belonged to other families. Still, standing beside his grave, I realized something painful. Even difficult fathers leave impossible holes behind. My older brother, Ethan, barely looked up from his phone during the service. Every few minutes his screen lit up, and he'd step away pretending to answer important business calls. My younger sister, Natalie, cried dramatically every time another guest approached us. The second they walked away, the tears disappeared. My husband, David, rested one hand on my shoulder the entire ceremony. From a distance, he probably looked like the perfect husband. Supportive, calm, dependable. I knew better. His attention wasn't on the minister or the funeral. He spent most of the service quietly studying the people who had shown up, judging watches, cars, clothes, estimating wealth the way other people estimated weather. That should have told me everything. Instead, I ignored it, just as I had ignored so many other small warnings over 27 years of marriage. After the burial, the family drove directly to my father's attorney. The law office overlooked the Savannah River. Tall windows, mahogany bookshelves, expensive paintings, the sort of place built to remind grieving families that money often outlives people. Harold Benson, my father's attorney for nearly 40 years, looked exhausted. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes before speaking. "Let's begin." Ethan leaned forward immediately. Natalie crossed one leg over the other. David settled comfortably into his chair, almost looking excited. The estate distribution unfolded exactly as everyone expected. Ethan inherited the lake house in North Carolina, nearly $1.5 million. Natalie inherited controlling ownership of Whitaker Financial Group, the family business, the prize everyone assumed would eventually be hers. Then Harold looked at me. He hesitated, only for a second, but I noticed. "Claire," he said quietly, "your father asked me to hand this to you personally." He reached beneath his desk and placed a small wooden box in front of me. That was all. No property deeds, no investment portfolio, no envelope, just a box. I lifted the lid. Inside rested an old silver pocket watch. The crystal was scratched. The leather strap had nearly fallen apart. The hands had stopped decades earlier. It looked completely worthless. Silence filled the room. Then David laughed. Not loudly, just enough. "Seriously?" He looked between me and Harold. That's the inheritance? Ethan smirked. Natalie covered her mouth to hide a smile. Heat slowly climbed into my face. Harold cleared his throat. Your father specifically instructed that Mrs. Carter receive this item personally. David shrugged. Well, I guess sentimental things have value too. The word sentimental sounded suspiciously close to worthless. I gently closed the box. Thank you, Harold. Then I stood. I wasn't going to let anyone watch me feel humiliated. Years earlier, I'd learned something valuable. People who enjoy embarrassing. You become deeply disappointed when you refuse to perform embarrassment for them. The drive home was painfully quiet. David broke the silence first. Ethan got lucky. I looked out the passenger window. That lake house alone is worth a fortune. Another pause. And Natalie basically owns the company now. More silence. Then he glanced toward the passenger seat where the wooden box rested. I just thought... He hesitated. I thought your father would have taken better care of you. I didn't answer, because if I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure I could stop. By the time we reached home, I was emotionally exhausted. I carried the watch inside and placed it carefully in the middle of the dining table. David glanced at it while hanging up his coat. You know, he said casually, it's actually kind of sad. 2 simple words, kind of sad, as if the watch somehow represented my value, as if my father's final gift measured how much I deserved. I quietly turned toward the sink and began washing dishes. Behind me, I heard David chuckle once more before walking into the living room. At the time, I believed the watch represented the end of my father's story. I couldn't have been more wrong, because 72 hours later, someone knocked on my front door, and with a single question, everything I believed about my family, my marriage, and my inheritance began to unravel. The knock came exactly 3 days later. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Not hurried, not uncertain. The kind of knock made by someone who already knew why they were there. I expected a package delivery. Instead, when I opened the door, I found Arthur Brooks standing on my porch. He looked older than I remembered. Much older. His shoulders had narrowed with age, and deep lines framed his weathered face. But his eyes hadn't changed at all. They were calm, observant, the kind of eyes that noticed things everyone else missed. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he smiled. Hello, Claire. It's been a long time. It has. The November wind carried dry maple leaves across the porch between us. Arthur didn't move. Instead, he looked past me, straight toward the dining room, straight toward the small wooden box. The moment he saw it, his shoulders relaxed, almost as though he had just confirmed something important. May I come in? Of course. I stepped aside. He entered slowly, removed his coat with careful movements, and placed his old leather hat on the hallway table. Then, without asking another question, he walked directly toward the dining room. His attention never left the watch. Not once. The room suddenly felt unusually quiet. Even the refrigerator's hum seemed distant. Arthur stopped beside the table. He gently rested one hand on the wooden box. Not the way someone touches an object, the way someone greets an old friend. Then he turned toward me. Tell me something. What? His expression became unexpectedly serious. Have you opened the back of the watch yet? Again, the exact same question. I frowned. No. I didn't even know it opened. Arthur smiled softly. I was hoping you'd say that. Something inside me tightened. What aren't you telling me? Instead of answering immediately, he slowly lifted the watch from the box. His fingers moved over the worn silver case with remarkable familiarity. I haven't held this watch in nearly 30 years. You knew my grandfather carried it? Arthur laughed quietly. Knew? He shook his head. Claire, your grandfather carried this watch every single day for almost 40 years. I stared at him. It was that important? Arthur looked directly into my eyes. Walter Whitaker wasn't the kind of man who carried useless things. Something about that sentence stayed with me, because it sounded exactly like my grandfather. Every tool had a purpose. Every promise mattered. Nothing was wasted. Arthur slowly sat across from me. Did your father ever tell you much about Walter? I smiled sadly. My father didn't tell me much about anyone. Arthur nodded. I suppose that's true. For a while we simply sat in silence. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time since the funeral. Golden light stretched across the dining room table. Arthur finally spoke again. We met in Charleston in 1964. You and Grandpa? He smiled. We were 22, completely broke. Certain we'd become millionaires before 30. Were you? Arthur laughed. No, but Walter became something much more valuable. What was that? He looked at the watch. A man everyone trusted. The answer surprised me. Arthur noticed. Most people spend their lives chasing success. Walter spent his life earning trust. I lowered my eyes. Without realizing why, my throat tightened. Because those words described someone else too. Me. For years I had held everyone together. Birthday parties, hospital visits, family holidays, financial problems. When someone needed help, they called me. When someone needed appreciation, they called someone else. Arthur seemed to read my thoughts. He saw that in you. My grandfather? Yes. I looked away. My father never did. Arthur became quiet. After a long pause, he answered honestly. No. Oddly enough, the truth hurt less than pretending. Arthur turned the watch over in his hands. Your grandfather believed loyalty was the rarest quality a person could possess. He looked directly at me, and he believed you had it. I almost laughed. Loyal people usually end up being taken for granted. Arthur nodded slowly. Exactly. That's why he protected yours. Before I could ask what he meant, Arthur reached into his jacket pocket. He removed something so small I almost missed it. A tiny jeweler's screwdriver. What is that for? Instead of answering, he held out his hand. May I? I gave him the watch. His fingers moved carefully across the back. Searching, feeling. Finally, he stopped. There. He inserted the screwdriver into a nearly invisible groove beside the winding stem. Nothing happened. For several seconds, he remained perfectly still. Then, click, a soft metallic sound echoed through the room. The back of the watch slowly opened. I leaned forward. My heartbeat became impossibly loud. There, I whispered. There was a compartment. Arthur smiled. Your grandfather always enjoyed leaving puzzles. Hidden inside the watch were 3 objects. A tiny brass key, a folded piece of yellowed paper, and a sealed envelope. For several moments, neither of us touched them. It felt almost disrespectful to rush. Arthur nodded toward the contents. They're yours. With trembling fingers, I picked up the folded paper first. Carefully unfolding it, I found a handwritten address. First Atlantic Trust Bank, Jacksonville, Florida. Below it, a safety deposit box number. And a date, 23 years earlier. What is this? Arthur didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the envelope. I carefully opened it. Inside rested a single handwritten note. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My grandfather's. It contained only one sentence. For the one who understands loyalty. Nothing else. No explanation. No instructions. Just 7 words. I read them once. Then again. Then a third time. Something about those words made tears fill my eyes. Because loyalty had defined my entire life. I stayed when things became difficult. I forgave when nobody apologized. I carried people who never noticed the weight. Arthur watched quietly. He knew. Knew what? That you'd be the one. How could he possibly know that? Arthur smiled. Because Walter judged character, not confidence. Silence settled over the room. Then another question surfaced, one that suddenly felt far more important. Did my father know about this? Arthur's face changed. The pause gave me the answer before he spoke. Yes. I closed my eyes. He knew all these years? Yes. And never told me? No. The room suddenly felt colder. Arthur took a slow breath. He made me promise something. What? If that watch ever found its way back to you, I was to find you immediately. I stared at him. Immediately? Within 24 hours. My pulse quickened. Why? Arthur looked at the tiny brass key resting in my hand. Because your grandfather believed the contents of that safety deposit box should only be opened after you finally saw people for who they truly were. Those words settled heavily between us. For reasons I couldn't explain, my first thought wasn't about my father. It wasn't even about my grandfather. It was about David, my husband. And suddenly, for the very first time, I wondered whether the biggest secret in my life had never been the watch at all. The drive to Jacksonville took just over 2 hours. Arthur insisted on driving. Normally, I would have argued. That morning, I didn't have the energy. The tiny brass key rested inside my purse beside my grandfather's note. For the one who understands loyalty. I must have read those 7 words 20 times before we crossed into Florida. Each time, they seemed to mean something different. Arthur kept both hands on the steering wheel. He wasn't a man who filled silence simply because silence existed. That was one of the things I'd always admired about him. Around noon, we stopped at a small diner just off Interstate 95. Neither of us was particularly hungry. Still, Arthur ordered coffee. I picked at a grilled cheese sandwich without tasting it. Finally, I looked at him. "You've known about this all these years?" "Yes." "You never wanted to tell me?" He stirred his coffee slowly. "Every day." I waited. "But I made Walter a promise." "My grandfather trusted you that much?" Arthur smiled. "He trusted very few people." Then he looked directly at me. "You were one of them." Those words stayed with me for the rest of the drive. By early afternoon, we pulled into the parking lot of First Atlantic Trust Bank. The building wasn't impressive. No marble fountains, no towering glass walls, just an old brick structure surrounded by perfectly trimmed hedges, the sort of place people rarely noticed. Arthur parked the car but didn't immediately get out. Instead, he looked at me. "You ready?" I laughed nervously. "No." He nodded. "Good." "Good?" The truth usually arrives before we're ready. That sounded exactly like something Grandpa Walter would have said. Inside, the bank felt strangely quiet. Soft music played overhead. Everything smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. A woman at the reception desk greeted us politely. Arthur introduced himself. The moment she heard my name, her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. She picked up the phone, spoke quietly, then stood. "Please follow me, Mrs. Whitaker." My heart began beating faster. We were escorted through a secure hallway and into a private vault room. Waiting there was the branch manager, a distinguished man in his late 60s wearing a charcoal suit. He smiled politely. Then his eyes landed on the tiny brass key in my hand. Recognition flashed across his face. Exactly the same look Arthur had given the watch. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said warmly. "We've been expecting you." I blinked. "Expecting me?" He opened a leather folder. "Instructions were left many years ago." "How many?" He glanced down. 23 years. The number hit me harder than I expected. 23 years. Someone had been waiting almost a quarter of a century. For me. The manager unlocked a large safety deposit drawer and stepped back. "The rest is yours." I looked at Arthur. He simply nodded. My hands trembled as I inserted the brass key. For one terrifying second, I thought it wouldn't fit. Then, it turned. A soft metallic click echoed through the room. The drawer slid open. I wasn't looking at jewelry, or cash, or gold. Inside rested several thick folders, sealed envelopes, old photographs, and carefully organized documents. It looked less like an inheritance, and more like someone's entire life had been preserved inside a metal box. Arthur quietly stepped away to give me privacy. The first envelope contained only one word, Claire, written in my grandfather's handwriting. I carefully opened it. Inside rested a short letter. "Claire, if you're reading this, then the watch found its way back to you. That means I was right. People often mistake loyalty for weakness. They couldn't be more wrong. The strongest people are usually the ones who continue loving after receiving very little in return. Everything inside this box belongs to you. Trust Arthur. Trust yourself. And remember one thing. The truth never destroys good people. It simply reveals them. Love always. Grandpa." By the time I finished reading, my vision had blurred. I blinked several times before carefully folding the letter again. Arthur remained respectfully silent. The manager quietly excused himself, leaving us alone. I reached for the second envelope. This one carried different handwriting, my father's. Immediately, my stomach tightened. My father rarely wrote letters. Growing up, birthdays usually came with signed cards. Christmas gifts carried price tags, not messages. Seeing pages covered in his handwriting felt almost unnatural. I unfolded the paper. "Claire, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. There are things I should have told you years ago. I didn't. Partly because I believed I was protecting you. Partly because I was afraid. Perhaps I was wrong." I stopped. Already, this felt like more honesty than my father had shared during his entire lifetime. I kept reading. The next sentence stole every bit of air from my lungs. "Several years ago, I hired a private investigator. Not because of you, because of David." I froze. My eyes refused to move. I read the sentence again, then again. "Because of David, my husband." Across the table, Arthur quietly lowered his eyes. He already knew. Of course he did. I forced myself to continue reading. At first, I believed David was hiding financial problems. The investigation uncovered something else. Something much worse. David has been unfaithful for years. I stopped breathing. Not figuratively. Literally. The room disappeared around me. Only the letter remained. Only those words. David has been unfaithful for years. I looked up at Arthur. His face said everything. He wasn't surprised. He had carried this truth alone for years. Slowly, I looked back down at the page, afraid of what the next sentence might say. I forced myself to keep reading. My hands had started trembling so badly that I had to place the letter flat on the table. For several seconds, the words blurred together. Then they came back into focus. I wanted to tell you many times, more times than you will ever know. But every time I tried, I saw the way you looked at him. You believed you had found the kind of love your mother and I never managed to build. I convinced myself that protecting your happiness, even if it was built on lies, was kinder than destroying it. Looking back, I believe that was the greatest mistake of my life. My throat tightened. Those weren't the words of the cold, distant father I had known. They were the words of a man carrying regret, real regret. I kept reading. The investigators' reports are included in the third folder. If you are reading them, it means you finally deserve the truth. I am sorry, Claire. More than you know. Dad. I lowered the pages into my lap. The room was completely silent. Outside the vault, I could hear distant footsteps and muffled conversations. Life was continuing as though nothing had changed. Mine had just stopped. Arthur quietly poured a glass of water and slid it toward me. I didn't touch it. Instead, I looked at him. When did you know? He answered without hesitation. The same day your father did. 8 years? He nodded once. 8 years. I closed my eyes. You both watched me celebrate anniversaries. Another nod. You watched me defend him. Yes. You watched me build a future with someone you already knew was lying to me. Arthur looked genuinely heartbroken. I did. For a moment, anger surged through me, not at David, at both of them. You should have told me. Arthur didn't argue. I wanted to, but your father made me promise. I know. He believed you'd leave only when you were ready to see the truth. I laughed bitterly. So everyone kept deciding what was best for me. Arthur lowered his head. I know how that sounds. It sounds exactly like my entire life. Eventually, I reached for the third folder. It felt strangely heavy, almost too heavy to lift. Inside were investigator reports, dates, receipts, maps, photographs. I stared at the very first image. David stood outside a restaurant, his arm wrapped comfortably around a woman I'd never seen before. She was laughing. He was looking at her the way he hadn't looked at me in years. Natural, relaxed, happy. The timestamp in the corner read, 8 years earlier. I turned the page. Another photograph, different city, different season, same woman, another, and another. Christmas decorations, summer vacations, business conferences, weekend brunches. The pictures stretched across years, not weeks, not months, years. This wasn't an affair. It was another relationship, another life, one carefully hidden behind my own. My heartbeat echoed inside my ears. I kept turning pages, hotel receipts, airline confirmations, restaurant reservations, everything documented, everything dated, everything impossible to deny. Then I reached the final photograph. Unlike the others, this one had been taken only 6 months earlier. David stood outside a modern apartment building. The woman kissed him. His hand rested gently against her face, but it wasn't the kiss that froze me. It was the address, because I recognized it instantly. I drove past that building every Tuesday on my way home from volunteering at the community center. 20 minutes from our house, 20 minutes, for 8 years. His second life hadn't existed across the country. It had existed practically next door. I slowly lowered the photograph. I've driven past that building hundreds of times. Arthur nodded quietly. I know. I never saw them. They were careful. No, I whispered. I never thought to look. Arthur reached across the table and gently closed the folder. Claire. I looked at him. This isn't the end. It feels like it. He shook his head. No. It feels like the end because you've only just discovered the lie. I frowned. What do you mean? Arthur hesitated. Then he looked toward the remaining folders still sitting inside the safety deposit box. There are things in those files. That even your father didn't fully understand. A chill ran through my body. What things? Arthur took a slow breath. The affair wasn't the biggest secret David was hiding. I stared at him. What are you saying? His expression became unusually serious. I'm saying, the photographs are only the beginning. I looked back toward the unopened folders. For the first time since arriving at the bank, I was no longer afraid of what I might find. I was afraid of how much still remained hidden. The drive home felt much longer than 2 hours. Arthur kept both hands on the steering wheel. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. The investigator's file rested on my lap, unopened. I had already seen enough to destroy 27 years of marriage. Or so I believed. Late afternoon sunlight spilled across the highway. Cars passed us. People laughed at gas stations. Families loaded groceries into SUVs. The ordinary world continued moving. Mine had quietly stopped. When we finally pulled into my driveway, my house looked exactly as it always had. White shutters, blue front door, the porch swing David had insisted on buying 15 years earlier. Funny how familiar places can suddenly feel like someone else's life. Arthur turned off the engine. You want me to come inside? I considered it, then shook my head. No. He nodded. If you need me, I know. Before leaving, he looked at me one last time. Claire. Yes? Don't make any permanent decisions tonight. I won't. I mean it. I know. He smiled sadly, then drove away. I stood alone in my driveway until his car disappeared around the corner. Inside, the house was silent. David wasn't home yet. For the first time in days, I was grateful. I placed the investigator's folders on the dining room table. The same table where we had celebrated birthdays. Hosted Thanksgiving dinners. Helped our daughter finish school projects. Now it looked like evidence in a criminal investigation. I walked into the kitchen and made tea. Not because I wanted tea, because I desperately needed something ordinary. The kettle whistled. The familiar sound somehow kept me grounded. David came home just after 7. He walked through the front door carrying 2 takeout bags. Chinese food, my favorite. The sight almost made me cry. Not because it was thoughtful, because I suddenly realized he probably brought home my favorite meal after spending the afternoon lying to me. Hey, he smiled naturally. You haven't eaten, have you? I looked at him. Really looked. The gray beginning to appear around his temples, the tiny scar beneath his chin from a camping trip 20 years ago, the wedding ring still resting comfortably on his finger. How could someone look exactly the same and become a complete stranger? I'm fine. You sure? Just tired. He kissed my forehead. Exactly as he always did. Exactly the same way he probably kissed me after seeing her. My stomach twisted. While unpacking the food, his phone buzzed. He smiled automatically before turning the screen away from me. The movement lasted less than a second. 8 years ago, I never would have noticed. Now, it was impossible not to. He typed a quick reply, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. Everything okay? I asked quietly. He looked up. Work. The lie came effortlessly. Smooth. Practiced. I nodded. Of course. Dinner was painfully normal. We talked about groceries, the neighbor's new fence, a leaking faucet upstairs. 27 years together had made ordinary conversation effortless. Now every word sounded artificial, every smile rehearsed, every silence full of things neither of us dared say. When dinner ended, David carried our plates into the kitchen. I've got these. Thanks. He smiled again, the same smile I'd trusted for nearly 3 decades, that night after he fell asleep. I returned to the dining room. Moonlight stretched across the hardwood floor. The folders waited exactly where I'd left them. I opened the investigator's file again. This time, I forced myself to read every page, no matter how much it hurt. Gradually, a larger pattern began to emerge. The affair wasn't the only secret. Not even close. Financial reports appeared throughout the file. Property records, expense reimbursements, bank transfers. At first, they looked ordinary. Then I noticed something. The same account number appeared again. And again. And again. Always connected to the same apartment building. Always connected to shell companies I'd never heard of. Always approved personally by David. Midnight came and went before I found the document that made everything click. A property purchase agreement. I frowned. The apartment wasn't rented. It had been purchased 9 years earlier. Not under David's name. Under an LLC. The investigator had traced ownership. The company belonged to David. I stared at the page. for nearly a full minute, then whispered aloud, "Oh my God." He hadn't been visiting another woman's apartment. He had bought her a home, with money that should have belonged to our family. The photographs had shown emotion. The financial records showed commitment. Somehow, that hurt even more. The next morning, I called the investigator whose name appeared throughout the reports. To my surprise, he answered, "Older, retired." His voice carried the quiet patience of someone who had spent decades observing other people's secrets. When I introduced myself, he became silent. Finally, he spoke. "Your father loved you very much." The sentence caught me completely off guard, because love had never been the word I associated with my father. "He hired you?" "Yes." "To investigate David?" "At first," the investigator replied carefully, "he wanted me to examine some financial concerns." I waited, but after a few weeks, the focus changed. "To my husband?" "Yes." His answer was gentle, almost apologetic. I gripped the phone tighter. "What else did you find?" There was a long pause. Then he quietly answered, "Far more than your father ever wanted to know." The conversation lasted almost an hour. I sat alone at the dining room table while morning sunlight slowly filled the room. The retired investigator never rushed. He answered every question carefully. Sometimes he paused for several seconds before speaking, as though choosing the kindest version of the truth. "There wasn't just one affair," he finally said. I felt my stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "I mean the relationship became permanent." I closed my eyes. "I already know about the apartment." There was silence on the other end. "So your father left you everything?" "Yes." Another pause. "Then you also know the apartment wasn't paid for personally." "No, it wasn't." I frowned. "The mortgage payments came from David's consulting company." "My husband's business?" "Yes." "But they were disguised as operating expenses." I slowly leaned back in my chair. So while I thought we were saving for retirement, he was financing another household. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because of the money, because every sacrifice suddenly meant something different. The vacations we postponed, the renovations we delayed, the conversations about being careful with spending, all of it had been built on a lie. There was something else. The investigator continued quietly. "What?" "Your father originally believed David was simply careless with money. And then, he discovered David had been moving funds through several small companies." "Illegal?" "No." The answer surprised me. "Unethical." He let that word settle. "Not enough to trigger criminal charges, but enough to hide where the money was really going." I rubbed my forehead. "How much?" "I can't give an exact number. But over 8 years?" He sighed. "Well into 7 figures." My breath caught. Millions, not one dramatic transfer. Thousands of small decisions. Month after month, year after year. A second life, paid for one quiet transaction at a time. When the call ended, I remained exactly where I was. The tea beside me had gone completely cold. I stared through the dining room window at the maple tree in our front yard. Its last orange leaves drifted gently to the ground. Everything looked peaceful, beautiful, ordinary. Inside, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Around noon, my phone rang again. "Arthur, how are you holding up?" "I don't know." I expected that answer. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then Arthur cleared his throat. "Claire?" "Yes?" "I think you should look through the remaining papers from the safety deposit box." "I already did." "No." His voice became firmer. "I mean all of them." I frowned. "I thought I had." "There should be another folder underneath the property records." I immediately walked back to the dining table. Carefully lifting the stack, I noticed something I had somehow overlooked. A thinner leather folder hidden beneath everything else. My pulse quickened. "I found it." Arthur's voice softened. "Open it!" Inside were trust documents, investment statements, tax summaries. Nothing looked dramatic at first. Then my eyes reached the final page. I stopped breathing. The total value sat neatly printed across the bottom. 18,742,183. I blinked. Read it again. Then again. The number refused to change. Nearly $19 million. Quietly invested. Carefully protected. Growing for decades. I whispered, "This can't be right." Arthur answered gently, "It is. My father never mentioned this." "He couldn't." "Why not?" "Because it was never his." I slowly lowered myself into a chair. The trust listed only one beneficiary. There was no shared inheritance, no equal distribution, no division between siblings. Only one name, mine. I turned another page. A handwritten note had been attached. For the grandchild who chooses loyalty over ambition. Tears filled my eyes before I even realized I was crying. It wasn't the money. Not really. It was the reason. For my entire life, I had believed I was the overlooked child. The dependable one. The invisible one. And yet, my grandfather had been watching all along. He hadn't valued success, or status, or confidence. He had valued character. For the first time in my life, someone had chosen me simply because they believed in who I was. At that exact moment, I heard the garage door opening. David was home, and judging by the unusually cheerful whistle echoing through the hallway, he had absolutely no idea that everything had already changed. David walked into the kitchen carrying his briefcase, humming quietly to himself. He looked happy, relaxed, the kind of relaxed that only comes from believing everything is under control. He loosened his tie, set his keys on the counter, and smiled when he saw me. Hey, you've been home all day? I took the day off. He nodded absent-mindedly. Probably a good idea after everything with your dad. The irony almost made me smile. After everything with my dad, those words meant something entirely different now. He walked to the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of water, and turned toward me. You okay? I studied his face. 27 years, 27 birthdays, 27 anniversaries, one daughter, thousands of mornings, thousands of ordinary conversations. And somehow, I realized I had never actually known the man standing in front of me. I'm fine. You sure? I'm just thinking. He smiled. Dangerous. Normally I would have laughed. This time, I simply nodded. Dinner that night felt strangely peaceful. Not because anything had improved. Because I had stopped pretending. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to fix us. I wasn't trying to make conversation. I wasn't trying to fill uncomfortable silence. I simply observed. David talked about work, a new client, a possible expansion, the stock market. I noticed how naturally he lied. Not only about the affair, about everything. Little exaggerations, half-truths, convenient omissions. Things I had once dismissed as harmless. Now they formed a pattern. After dinner, he poured himself a glass of wine. Then looked at me. Claire? His tone changed. Immediately. I knew that tone. Every married person knows it. The rehearsed tone. The speech someone practices during their commute home. I think we need to talk. I folded my hands calmly. So do I. He looked relieved, as though we'd somehow reached the same conclusion. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I'm sure you have. He didn't notice the meaning behind my words. We've changed. I almost smiled. Of course, there it was. The sentence every divorce attorney probably hears 5 times a day. We've grown apart. Another classic. I still care about you. Naturally. I always will. How generous. But there it was. The word that ends marriages. I don't think either of us is happy anymore. Silence settled between us. I watched him carefully. He believed he was being kind. He believed he was controlling the conversation. He believed I knew nothing. Finally, he took a deep breath. I think we should get a divorce. The words landed softly. Without drama. Without shouting. Without tears. Because the real heartbreak had happened yesterday inside a bank vault. This was simply confirmation. I looked at him quietly. How long? He frowned. What? How long have you been planning this? He looked away for just a second. Long enough. I don't know. Lie. People telling the truth don't search for simple answers. I've been thinking about it. Thinking. Interesting choice of words. Not struggling. Not trying. Thinking. I nodded slowly. And why now? He sighed. I think we've become different people. Different people. After 27 years. After building an entire life together. Everything reduced to a sentence polished enough to sound reasonable. I asked the question I already knew the answer to. Is there someone else? For the first time, David froze. Barely. Half a second. But I saw it. No. The lie came smoothly. Too smoothly. Practiced. Professional. I simply stared at him. The silence stretched. He shifted uncomfortably. Finally he asked, Why are you looking at me like that? I stood up. Okay. His eyebrows lifted. Okay? Okay. Nothing more. I walked into the kitchen. Behind me, I heard his chair scrape against the floor. He followed. Claire? I turned around. What exactly were you expecting? He blinked. What do you mean? I folded my arms. Were you expecting me to cry? His face changed. To beg? No. To ask you to stay? He said nothing, because that's exactly what he'd expected. Instead, he was facing something much more unsettling. A woman who already knew the truth. He just didn't know that yet. For the first time all evening, I watched uncertainty appear in his eyes, and uncertainty frightened people like David, because uncertainty meant they were no longer in control. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. David stood in the middle of the kitchen, studying my face as if trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly no longer made sense. Finally, he cleared his throat. So that's it? I looked at him calmly. What else is there to say? I thought we'd talk. We are talking. No, he said, shaking his head. Really talk. I almost laughed. After 8 years of lies, now he wanted honesty. Interesting. The next morning, while David left for work believing our conversation had gone surprisingly well, I called an attorney. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She specialized in high-asset divorces. Arthur had recommended her years ago, though I hadn't understood why until now. We met that afternoon. Margaret listened quietly while I explained everything. The watch, the safety deposit box, my father's letters, the investigators' reports, the apartment, the trust. She interrupted only once. Do you have documentation? Without speaking, I slid the folders across her desk. She spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing them. When she finally looked up, her expression had completely changed. Mrs. Whitaker. Yes? Your husband has absolutely no idea what you've discovered. No. She nodded slowly. Good. I frowned. Good? The person holding the truth should never rush to reveal it. Over the following 2 weeks, Margaret and her legal team quietly verified every document, every bank transfer, every property record, every shell company, every financial statement. Everything matched. The affair wasn't speculation. It wasn't suspicion. It was documented. The hidden apartment belonged to an LLC David controlled. The monthly expenses had been disguised inside his business accounts. Luxury vacations, furniture, insurance, utilities, even property taxes. 8 years. Thousands of carefully hidden transactions. When Margaret finished reviewing everything, she closed the final folder. I've handled divorces for almost 30 years. I waited. This is one of the most organized investigations I've ever seen. My father planned all this. No. She looked directly at me. Your father prepared for the possibility that one day, you'd need the truth. 3 weeks later, David officially filed for divorce. Margaret smiled when she saw the paperwork. Exactly on schedule. What do you mean? He believes you're vulnerable. He thinks your inheritance was a broken watch. I nodded. He'll negotiate from a position of confidence. And that's good? It's very good. She folded her hands. People make mistakes when they're overconfident. Our first settlement meeting took place inside a downtown conference room. Large windows overlooked the river. A polished walnut table stretched nearly 20 feet across the room. David arrived with his attorney, Bradley Morrison, confident, expensive suit, perfect smile, the kind of lawyer who had never learned the meaning of humility. He greeted everyone politely before opening a thick folder. Mrs. Whitaker, he began smoothly. My client would like this process to remain respectful. Margaret smiled. So would mine. Bradley nodded. Excellent. He slid several documents across the table. Property division, retirement accounts, savings, investments. The proposal looked fair, until I actually read it. David would keep his company, most investment accounts, nearly all business assets. The division wasn't outrageous, just carefully designed to favor the person who believed I had nowhere else to turn. Margaret waited silently. I closed the folder, then asked one simple question. Has your client disclosed every asset? The room became very quiet. Bradley answered immediately. Of course. I nodded once, then reached into my briefcase. Not for the trust. Not yet. For the investigator's file. I slowly placed the first photograph onto the table. Silence. David looked down. His face lost all color. Bradley frowned. What exactly is this? No one answered. Instead, I slid another photograph forward. Then another. restaurant receipts, hotel records, property documents, the LLC registration, the apartment purchase agreement. Every piece of evidence arrived one page at a time. No accusations, no raised voices, just facts. Bradley's confident smile disappeared. Completely. He looked at David. "What is this?" David said nothing. His jaw tightened. His attorney picked up another document. Then another. Finally, he lowered them carefully. He looked directly at his client. "You didn't tell me any of this." David remained silent. For the first time since our marriage began falling apart, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not because I had discovered the affair. Because he had just realized I knew far more than he ever imagined. The room remained completely silent. David stared at the photographs spread across the conference table as though they belonged to someone else's life. His attorney, Bradley Morrison, slowly removed his glasses. "David," his voice was noticeably different now. "What else haven't you told me?" No answer. Bradley looked at Margaret, then back at his client. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "I think we need a private conversation." Margaret calmly closed her notebook. "We have no objection." David stood without looking at me. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, he looked frightened. Not nervous, not embarrassed, frightened. 20 minutes later, they returned. Bradley's confidence had vanished. He no longer sounded like a man negotiating from strength. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said carefully, "my client would like to discuss a revised settlement." Margaret looked at me. I nodded. "Go ahead." The new proposal looked very different, much more balanced, much more realistic. David barely spoke. He signed where Bradley instructed him to sign. The man who had spent years controlling every conversation suddenly had nothing left to say. Just as the meeting was ending, Margaret quietly placed one final folder onto the table. "The trust." Bradley frowned. "What trust?" I watched David look up, confused. Margaret opened the first page. This trust was established by Claire's grandfather more than 20 years ago. Bradley scanned the documents. Then he stopped. His eyes widened. He looked at the total again, then a second time. Finally, he slowly turned toward David. "You didn't know about this?" David frowned. "Know about what?" Bradley pushed the folder toward him. David read the first page, then the second. Then his face went completely white. Almost $19 million. Protected, legally separate, never part of the marriage, never available during the divorce, never his. For several seconds, he simply stared. He looked at me. "You knew?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Long enough." His shoulders dropped. Everything he had assumed about me had just collapsed. I wasn't the wife left with a broken pocket watch. I wasn't financially dependent. I wasn't helpless, and I certainly wasn't alone. The final hearing took place 6 weeks later. By then, most of the legal arguments had disappeared. Facts have a way of simplifying complicated stories. The judge reviewed every document carefully. She asked questions, made notes, then folded her hands. "Mr. Carter." David stood. "Yes, Your Honor." She looked directly at him. "Is there anything else your wife should know regarding your financial disclosures?" The courtroom became perfectly still. David opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The judge waited. Still, nothing. Finally, she nodded. "I'll take that as a no." Her ruling was calm, professional. There were no dramatic speeches. Real life rarely offers those. David kept his business. I kept the family trust. The marital property was divided according to the revised agreement. The hidden apartment, the concealed financial transfers, the false disclosures, all of them influenced the final settlement. Not because revenge mattered, because honesty did. Outside the courthouse, the November air felt lighter than it had in months. Arthur was waiting beside his car. He smiled the moment he saw me. "Well, it's over." He nodded. "I thought you'd say that." We stood together watching people come and go. Lawyers, families, reporters chasing other stories. Life continued, exactly as it always does. A few weeks later, I visited my grandfather's grave. For the first time, I brought the pocket watch with me. The old silver case had been professionally restored, the cracked crystal replaced, the movement repaired. It ticked quietly in my hand, steady, reliable, alive again. Just before leaving, I whispered, "You were right." The wind moved gently through the oak trees. For a moment, I almost imagined him smiling. Over the following year, I learned how to manage the trust, not as a fortune, as a responsibility. My grandfather hadn't spent decades building wealth so someone could buy expensive cars or larger houses. He had built security, opportunity, hope. So that's exactly what I chose to create. I established the Whitaker Family Scholarship, helping students who had spent their teenage years caring for aging parents or grandparents instead of chasing opportunities for themselves. Then I launched a small business grant program in Savannah. Nothing flashy, just practical help for honest people trying to build better lives. Arthur often reminded me, money reveals character. It rarely changes it. I never forgot those words. Nearly a year after my father's funeral, Arthur invited me to lunch at a small cafe overlooking the marina. He looked older, more tired, but peaceful. As we finished dessert, he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a sealed envelope. For later. What is it? You'll understand. 11 days later, Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 81. The phone call left me sitting silently at my kitchen table for almost an hour. Losing him felt like losing the last bridge to my grandfather. A week after his funeral, I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a short handwritten letter. Claire, your father spent most of his life believing he could never become the man Walter was. He tried so hard to measure up that he forgot something important. Love isn't earned through perfection. Neither is respect. Walter understood that. Eventually, your father did too. There's one final gift enclosed. It belongs to you. Something small slipped into my hand. The watch. My grandfather's watch. Except, it wasn't broken anymore. The silver shined softly. The crystal was flawless. Most importantly, the hands moved again. Tick, tick, tick. Steady. Alive. Beneath it rested one final note. Some things only begin working again after time, truth, and patience. I sat there listening to the quiet rhythm for a very long time, thinking about my grandfather, my father, Arthur, even David. Life hadn't unfolded the way I once imagined. Neither had love. Neither had family. But perhaps that was the lesson all along. The greatest inheritance wasn't $19 million. It wasn't the trust. It wasn't even the watch. It was finally understanding my own worth. Not through someone else's approval. Not through marriage. Not through sacrifice. But through truth. Several months later, at the first Whitaker Scholarship ceremony, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for believing in someone like me." Without thinking, my fingers rested on the pocket watch in my jacket, and suddenly, I understood exactly what my grandfather had given me all those years ago. He believed in me, long before I believed in myself. Sometimes, that becomes the greatest inheritance anyone can ever leave behind. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part stayed with you the most? Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories about family, resilience, unexpected truths, and second chances. Until next time, take care of yourself. And remember, the people who fail to recognize your value never get to decide what your value truly is.